The story of Exodus is one of the most powerful and transformative narratives in human history. It is not just about ancient events, it is about faith, freedom, and the power of God moving through time. From oppression to deliverance, from bondage to redemption, the Exodus speaks to the heart of every believer. But what if this story is more than just history? What if it is a reflection of your own journey? Imagine standing at the edge of the Red Sea, with no visible way forward and the past closing in behind you. How often do we find ourselves in situations that seem impossible? The Exodus teaches us that no obstacle is greater than the will of God. The same God who parted the waters for Israel is the one who makes a way when there seems to be none. This journey is not just about escaping something, it is about stepping into something greater. The Israelites had to unlearn the mindset of slaves and embrace the identity of a chosen people. Likewise, we are often called to let go of past limitations, fears, and doubts to walk in the freedom God has prepared for us. As we dive into the story of Moses, Pharaoh, the plagues, the wilderness, and the Promised Land, we will uncover timeless lessons that still speak to us today. This is not just history. It is a blueprint for faith, endurance, and divine purpose. Are you ready to embark on this journey? Because the story of Exodus is not just about them. It is about us, and it is far from over. Since the dawn of humanity, the struggle between light and darkness has been at the core of history. The book of Exodus is not just a historical account, but a cosmic battle between the power of God and the false deities of Egypt. Each narrated event reveals a direct confrontation between divine sovereignty and the forces that sought to keep Israel in chains. Imagine witnessing the clash between a worldly king and the creator of the universe. It was a spiritual war where prophecy and the destiny of the chosen people were at stake. Israel was not just an oppressed people. They were a nation destined to carry the divine promise. Egypt, with its gods and rulers, sought to erase this identity. Pharaoh saw himself as a god incarnate, but the power of God would show that no earthly throne could compare to his reign. Every plague, every sign, was a blow against the false security of a civilization that believed it controlled its fate. And at the center of it all, Moses became the spokesperson for a revolution that would transcend centuries. Moses, once raised as an Egyptian prince, now saw himself as the instrument of divine justice. His mission was not only to free Israel from physical bondage, but also to restore their faith in the true God. When confronting Pharaoh, he was not just speaking to a king, but challenging a spiritual structure that enslaved minds and hearts. And us? How often do we find ourselves trapped in systems that seem unbreakable? The story of Exodus teaches us that no chain is strong enough before the power of God. At every step of this story, a message unfolds. God is faithful to his promises. When he speaks, he fulfills. It may seem delayed to human eyes, but prophecy never fails. Israel suffered for years, saw generations grow up under the weight of chains, but the time of redemption came. If you have ever felt forgotten or hopeless, know that the same force that freed Israel is still active today. God's timing is never late. Every event in Exodus is filled with meaning. The plagues were not just punishments, but demonstrations that no god, system, or king can resist the power of God. When the Nile turned to blood, it marked the death of Egypt's false security. When darkness covered the land, it revealed that true light did not come from pagan gods. Each act was a wake-up call, a declaration that oppression will never have the final word. And then we reach the climax of this spiritual war, the night when Egypt's firstborn fell, and Pharaoh finally gave in. Egypt's sorrow contrasted with Israel's hope. The sacrificed lamb, whose blood marked the Israelites' doors, foreshadowed an even greater deliverance in the future. Do you see how everything was interconnected? Nothing was by chance. It was a meticulous plan where every detail pointed to something greater. Now, imagine being among the Israelites that night. The fear, the expectation, the tension in the air. Everything they knew was about to change. And just like them, we often resist change out of fear of the unknown. But faith requires bold steps. When God calls, he also provides the way. And this leads us to the next chapter of this journey. The first glimpse of freedom and the challenges that would come with it. The Israelites' oppression in Egypt was not just a chapter of history. It was a defining moment in their identity. generations of Israelites were born into slavery, knowing no other reality than harsh labor and subjugation under Pharaoh's rule. Egypt was once a place of refuge for their ancestors, but over time, it became a land of chains. Pharaoh feared their numbers and strength, so he tightened his grip, ensuring that Israel would remain weak and dependent. Yet, even under oppression, the Israelites grew, their spirit unbroken, their faith tested but not extinguished. As Pharaoh's paranoia increased, so did his cruelty. The people of Israel were subjected to relentless toil, building Egypt's cities, crafting its monuments, and laboring under the scorching sun. The very ones who had once found favor in Egypt were now treated as a threat. Pharaoh's attempts to crush them only ignited a deeper resilience within them. They cried out in anguish, but who would listen? Who would stand for them against the might of Egypt? Yet even in suffering, a prophecy was unfolding. One that spoke of liberation and a return to the land promised to their forefathers. In a desperate bid to control Israel's future, Pharaoh commanded that all newborn Hebrew boys be cast into the Nile. It was an act of terror, a decree meant to extinguish hope. Can you imagine the heartbreak of mothers forced to give up their sons? The cries of the innocent lost in the waters of the great river? But where Pharaoh saw destruction, God saw deliverance. From the very waters meant to claim Hebrew lives, he would raise up a leader who would challenge the power of Egypt itself. The power of God was already at work, setting the stage for an unprecedented act of redemption. Despite their suffering, the Israelites clung to their heritage, passing down stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They held on to the prophecy that one day God would lead them out of bondage. Even as their backs ached from the lashes of their oppressors, their faith whispered of a coming freedom. In many ways, their endurance is a lesson for us today. How often do we find ourselves trapped in cycles of hardship, wondering if deliverance will ever come? The story of Israel reminds us that even in the darkest night, the dawn is already on its way. The Israelites' pain was not just physical, but emotional and spiritual. To be enslaved is to have your identity rewritten, your purpose stolen, your hope diminished. Egypt sought to break them, to erase their connection to their God and their destiny. Yet, the more Pharaoh oppressed them, the more they multiplied. It was as if adversity only strengthened the seed of promise within them. Isn't it interesting how challenges often prepare us for the very breakthroughs we long for? And then, as the cries of the people reached the heavens, the power of God stirred. A deliverer was being prepared, though no one knew it yet. In the palace of Pharaoh himself, a child would be raised with the wisdom of Egypt, but with a heart that belonged to Israel. Moses was the answer that no one saw coming, a part of the divine plan unfolding before their eyes. What Pharaoh feared most, the rise of a mighty Israel, was already in motion, beyond his control. The oppression of Israel was not the end of their story, but the beginning of their transformation. Every lash of the whip, every forced labor, every stolen child only made their need for God's intervention more undeniable. Their suffering became the backdrop against which the greatest act of deliverance would soon take place. And so, as Egypt tightened its grip, the stage was being set for an exodus that would shake the foundations of the world. Can you feel the weight of this moment? The tension, the waiting, the unseen movement of divine hands orchestrating something far beyond human understanding. The Israelites had no idea that their liberation was near, that a confrontation unlike any other was about to unfold. And with it, the greatest display of the power of God was just beyond the horizon. The birth and adoption of Moses was a turning point not only for Israel, but for the unfolding of divine prophecy. At a time when Pharaoh sought to erase the future of the Israelites by commanding the death of all newborn Hebrew boys, an extraordinary act of faith and defiance took place. A Levite woman, refusing to surrender to despair, placed her infant son in a basket and set him adrift on the Nile. Imagine the courage and heartbreak of that moment, entrusting her child's fate to the waters, praying that the power of God would intervene. As the basket floated down the river, it was not left to chance. Divine orchestration led it to Pharaoh's own daughter, who, upon seeing the helpless baby, was moved with compassion. She knew he was a Hebrew child, yet against the decree of her own father, she chose to adopt him. This moment was more than mere coincidence. It was the power of God turning the very system of oppression into an instrument of deliverance. The one who was meant to perish would now be raised within the halls of power, unknowingly being prepared for the greatest mission of all. Moses' early years were unlike any other Israelites. While his people toiled under harsh labor, he grew up in the palace, educated in the wisdom of Egypt, trained as a prince. But no matter how deeply he was immersed in Egyptian culture, his true identity could not be erased. Deep inside, he felt the pull toward his people, a connection he could not ignore. The hand of God was shaping him, forging him into the leader Israel would one day need. Imagine living between two worlds, raised in royalty, yet belonging to an enslaved nation. Moses' heart must have been torn, wrestling with his privileges while witnessing the suffering of his own blood. How many times do we find ourselves caught between comfort and calling, between security and purpose? Moses' journey reminds us that destiny often requires difficult choices, ones that demand courage and faith beyond human understanding. Then came the moment of awakening. One day, Moses witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. The injustice ignited something within him, a righteous anger, an uncontainable urge to act. Without hesitation, he intervened, striking down the oppressor. But instead of finding solidarity among his people, he faced rejection. The very ones he sought to defend questioned his authority. Fearful of Pharaoh's wrath, Moses fled into the wilderness, leaving behind the palace, his privileges, and the only life he had ever known. The wilderness became his place of transformation. In Midian, Moses found refuge, married Zipporah, and began a new chapter far from the turmoil of Egypt. Yet, the calling on his life did not disappear. It only waited for the appointed time. How often do we feel like we've lost our purpose, only to later realize we were in a season of preparation? The power of God does not waste any experience, even our moments of exile and solitude. For years, Moses lived as a shepherd, tending flocks instead of leading nations. But even in that quiet life, divine purpose was at work. The palace had given him knowledge. The wilderness would give him character. Leadership is not just about power. It's about humility, patience, and trust in something greater than oneself. Little did Moses know that the same voice that had guided him through every trial was about to call him into history's grandest deliverance. The birth and adoption of Moses were not just about saving one child. They were about setting the stage for the liberation of an entire people. The most powerful empire of the ancient world had unknowingly raised its own downfall, for within its walls, the deliverer of Israel was being prepared. And soon, the desert would no longer be a place of hiding, but the ground where the power of God would reveal its full force. The time of waiting was drawing to an end, and destiny was calling Moses by name. Moses' flight to Midian was not an escape from destiny, but a necessary step in his transformation. After killing an Egyptian in a moment of righteous fury, Moses found himself a fugitive, running from the wrath of Pharaoh and the uncertainty of his own identity. He had acted out of passion, but instead of gratitude from his fellow Israelites, he was met with rejection. His decision to flee was not just about survival. It was about facing the reality that liberation would not come through human strength alone. The journey into the wilderness was not a punishment, but a preparation. Alone, stripped of his former status, Moses was forced to confront who he truly was. No longer a prince of Egypt, not yet a leader of Israel, he wandered in a foreign land, a man without a home. But God was not done with him. The power of God often works in the quiet, in the exile, shaping us for something greater than we can imagine. In Midian, Moses' identity was not erased, it was being refined. Upon arriving in Midian, Moses found refuge in the household of Jethro, a priest of the land. He was welcomed, given a place among them, and eventually married Zipporah, Jethro's daughter. What seemed like an end was actually a new beginning. In the wilderness, Moses learned humility, patience, and the quiet strength of a shepherd. These were not just survival skills, they were leadership lessons, the kind that no palace could ever teach. As a shepherd, Moses tended flocks in solitude, walking the same terrain his people would one day cross in their journey to freedom. Every step, every challenge in that desert was preparing him for what was to come. The very wilderness that seemed like exile would become the proving ground for a nation. Isn't it interesting how what feels like delay is often divine preparation? The Power of God was at work, even when Moses didn't see it. He may have believed his purpose had been lost, buried under the weight of his past mistakes. But purpose is never lost, only redirected. God was shaping him, teaching him the ways of the land, the endurance of the desert, and the patience required to lead a stubborn people. The shepherd's staff in his hand would soon become a symbol of divine power. Moses likely questioned if he would ever return to Egypt. Perhaps he had resigned himself to a quiet life, far from the pain of his past. How often do we settle for less than we were called for because we assume our failures have disqualified us? But the power of God does not work within human limitations. Moses' story was far from over. Then, one day, amidst the ordinary, the extraordinary happened. As he led his flock near Mount Horeb, something caught his eye, a bush, burning but not consumed. It was a sight that defied logic, a moment that would change everything. God was about to speak, and Moses was about to realize that his time in Midian had not been a detour, but a divine appointment. The desert, the waiting, the solitude, it had all been leading to this moment. The voice of God would soon call him by name, reigniting the fire of his true purpose. The years of exile were ending, and the journey back to Egypt was about to begin. But this time, Moses would not go as a fugitive. He would return as a chosen leader, armed not with earthly power, but with the authority of the Almighty. And so, the stage was set. The power of God was about to be revealed in ways the world had never seen. What lay ahead would challenge the might of Egypt, defy human expectation, and usher in a redemption that would be remembered for generations. The burning bush was only the beginning. Moses had spent years in the wilderness, tending sheep, living a quiet life far from the grandeur of Egypt. He may have thought his days of significance were over, but the power of God was about to break into his solitude in an unimaginable way. One day, as he led his flock near Mount Horeb, he saw something extraordinary. A bush that burned but was not consumed. It was a sight that defied logic, a supernatural beacon demanding his attention. Curiosity drew him closer, but what he encountered was far more than a mysterious fire. It was the very presence of God. From within the flames, a voice called his name. Moses, Moses. Imagine hearing your name spoken by the divine, the weight of destiny pressing upon you in an instant. Trembling, Moses answered, "Here I am." And then came the command that would change everything. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. In that moment, Moses realized that he was not merely witnessing a miracle. He was standing in the presence of the Almighty. God identified himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, linking Moses to the great covenant of his ancestors. This was not a random encounter. It was the fulfillment of a divine plan that had been unfolding for centuries. The suffering of Israel had not gone unnoticed. I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt, God declared. I have heard their cries, and I have come down to rescue them. And then, the unthinkable. Moses was to be the instrument of this liberation. The weight of this calling crushed Moses. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He protested. How often do we feel unworthy when called to something greater than ourselves? But God's answer was simple and absolute. I will be with you. It was never about Moses' ability. It was about the power of God working through him, his past, his failures, his fears. None of it could stand against the divine plan. Still, Moses hesitated. What if they ask who sent me? He questioned. And God revealed his name in a way that would echo through eternity. I am who I am. This was not just a name. It was a declaration of eternal power, a promise that God was, is, and always will be. Armed with this revelation, Moses was given signs to perform. His staff turning into a serpent, his hand becoming leprous and then healed, to prove that this mission was not of human origin but divine authority. Even with these miracles, Moses was reluctant. I am not eloquent, he admitted, fearing his own inadequacies. How often do we let our perceived weaknesses hold us back? But God's response was unwavering. Who gave human beings their mouths? The creator of speech itself would empower him to speak, and when Moses still resisted, God provided Aaron as his spokesman, showing that even when we doubt, the power of God ensures that his plans will not be hindered. Moses had run from Egypt years before, but now he was commanded to return, not as a fugitive, but as a messenger of the Almighty. The burning bush was more than a sign. It was an initiation, a divine commission that would shake the very foundations of an empire. The time for waiting was over. The power of God was about to confront the might of Pharaoh, and Moses, despite his fears, would lead the charge. As he left that sacred encounter, Moses knew his life would never be the same. The desert had refined him, but now he was stepping into his true purpose. What lay ahead was impossible by human standards, but he was no longer relying on human strength. The God who called him from the burning bush would walk with him every step of the way. And so, the stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the world had seen. Pharaoh's heart would be tested, the gods of Egypt would be challenged, and the Israelites would witness firsthand the unstoppable force of the power of God. But before the battle began, Moses had to take the first step. Moses had received his calling, yet doubt still lingered in his heart. He questioned his ability to lead, his authority, and whether the Israelites would believe his message. Rather than rebuke him, God chose to equip him with undeniable signs, proof that he was not acting on his own. This was not just a display of power, but a direct challenge to Egypt's authority, a demonstration that divine intervention would not be ignored. Despite these astonishing signs, Moses remained hesitant. "I am not eloquent," he protested, citing his slow speech and lack of confidence. He saw his weakness as an obstacle, but God saw it as an opportunity. "Who gave human beings their mouths?" God asked. "Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help. You speak and will teach you what to say." Yet even after this, Moses pleaded for another solution. His fear was deeply rooted, but God, in his mercy, provided an answer. Aaron, Moses' own brother, would serve as his spokesman. Aaron was not just a solution to Moses' insecurity, he was a sign that God equips those he calls. Where Moses lacked confidence, Aaron had the voice. Where Moses hesitated, Aaron acted. The two brothers, working together, would confront Pharaoh and lead Israel. This was a partnership ordained by the power of God, ensuring that the mission would not be hindered by human weakness. As Moses and Aaron prepared to depart for Egypt, they first met with the Israelite elders. Imagine their skepticism. Generations had suffered under Pharaoh's hand, and now, two men claimed that their deliverance was near. But when Moses performed the signs as God commanded, the people believed. Hope, long buried under the weight of oppression, was rekindled. They bowed down and worshipped, for they knew that God had heard their cries. The journey back to Egypt was not just a physical return, but a step into the unknown. Pharaoh was not a man who would easily yield to demands, and Moses knew it. Yet he was no longer acting out of his own strength. The power of God was moving, and with each step, the confrontation drew closer. Would Pharaoh listen? Would the signs be enough? Or would it take something far greater to break the chains of Egypt? The anticipation built as Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh. With unwavering faith they proclaimed, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." But Pharaoh, hardened and unyielding, laughed at the demand. "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" he scoffed. The first test had begun, and so the signs were revealed. Moses cast down his staff, and it became a serpent. Pharaoh's magicians mimicked the feat. But then, in an unmistakable display of divine power, Moses' serpent swallowed theirs. It was a warning, a glimpse of what was to come. But Pharaoh's heart was stubborn, and he would not yield so easily. This was just the beginning. The power of God was about to shake Egypt to its core, demonstrating that no earthly king, no false deity, could stand against his will. The plagues were coming, and with them, a battle that would determine the fate of Israel. Pharaoh had been warned, but his defiance would bring consequences far beyond his imagination. The stage was set for a series of divine confrontations. Each plague would dismantle Egypt's illusion of control, showing that their gods held no power before the true and living God. The suffering of Israel was nearing its end, and their exodus was at hand. But before freedom, there would be a reckoning. One that would shake the world and leave no doubt as to who truly reigns over heaven and earth. As the first plague approached, the Nile, Egypt's lifeline, would be turned to blood, rendering its waters undrinkable. It was the first blow, an attack on the very foundation of Egypt's prosperity. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. The world was about to witness the undeniable force of divine justice, as one by one, Egypt's gods would fall before the might of the Almighty. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh was a battle of wills. But more than that, it was a demonstration of the power of God against the arrogance of human rule. Pharaoh, blinded by his own authority, refused to acknowledge the command to release the Israelites. His defiance set the stage for a series of plagues that would shake Egypt to its core. Each plague was not just a punishment, but a direct challenge to the gods of Egypt, proving their powerlessness before the Almighty. The first plague struck at the heart of Egypt's survival, the Nile River. Its waters turned to blood, killing the fish and making it undrinkable. The very source of Egypt's prosperity had become a sign of judgment. Yet, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. His magicians mimicked the transformation, giving him an excuse to dismiss Moses' warning. But the power of God was just beginning to reveal itself. Next came the plague of frogs, an overwhelming infestation that filled homes, beds, and even Pharaoh's palace. The Egyptian god Heket, symbolized by a frog, was powerless to stop the chaos. When Pharaoh pleaded for relief, Moses prayed, and the frogs died, filling the land with a putrid stench. But once the crisis passed, Pharaoh's stubbornness returned. Then, the dust of Egypt became lice, infesting people and animals alike. Even Pharaoh's magicians conceded, "This is the finger of God." Yet Pharaoh refused to listen. Swarms of flies followed, tormenting the Egyptians while sparing the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. The distinction was clear. These were no ordinary disasters, but targeted acts of divine judgment. The plagues intensified as disease struck Egypt's livestock, crippling their economy. Then, boils erupted on the skin of Egyptians and animals, an affliction so severe that even Pharaoh's magicians could not stand before Moses. But still, Pharaoh resisted, unwilling to submit to the authority of the one true God. Hail rained down like fire, devastating crops and livestock. Those who feared God's word took shelter, but those who ignored Moses' warning suffered great loss. Yet, Pharaoh's repentance was fleeting. He acknowledged his sin, but reneged on his promise to release the Israelites as soon as the danger had passed. Then came locusts, consuming what little remained of Egypt's food supply. The land was ravaged, yet Pharaoh's pride held firm. Darkness followed, a plague so thick that it could be felt, covering Egypt for 3 days. The Egyptians were trapped in fear, but the Israelites had light in their dwellings. Even then, Pharaoh refused full obedience, offering partial compromises that Moses would not accept. The final blow was the most devastating, the death of every firstborn in Egypt. This was not just an act of judgment, but the ultimate statement that the gods of Egypt could not protect even their own people. The power of God had spoken, and the weight of his justice could no longer be denied. Only then did Pharaoh finally relent, ordering the Israelites to leave. Yet even as they departed, Pharaoh's heart hardened once more, setting the stage for one final confrontation. One that would forever demonstrate that no power on earth could stand against the will of the Almighty. The night of the first Passover was unlike any other in history, a moment of divine protection and ultimate judgment. After enduring 9 plagues, Egypt remained unyielding, and Pharaoh's heart was as hardened as ever. But now, the final and most devastating act of divine intervention was at hand. God had declared that every firstborn in Egypt would perish, from Pharaoh's palace to the humblest servant's home. Yet, there was a way of escape for those who obeyed the command of the Lord. Moses relayed God's instructions to the Israelites with urgency. Each family was to take a lamb without blemish, slaughter it at twilight, and apply its blood to the doorposts of their homes. This act of obedience would serve as a sign, and when the Lord passed through the land to strike the firstborn, he would pass over the homes marked by the blood, sparing those inside. It was a defining moment, a demonstration that salvation comes through faith and obedience to the power of God. That night, as the Israelites gathered in their homes, They ate the Passover meal as instructed: roasted lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. They were to eat in haste, staff in hand, sandals on their feet, ready to leave at a moment's notice. This was not just a meal. It was a declaration that their time of bondage was ending. The weight of generations of slavery was about to be lifted, and freedom was within reach. As midnight struck, a great cry arose throughout Egypt. Every household without the mark of the blood suffered an unimaginable loss. The firstborn of every family and even the livestock perished. Pharaoh, who had defied God time and time again, was now broken. He called for Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and finally relented. "Go, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested." The urgency of the Exodus could not be overstated. The Israelites left in haste, their dough unleavened because there was no time to let it rise. God had commanded them to remember this day for generations to come, instituting the Passover as a lasting ordinance. It would serve as a memorial of how the power of God had delivered them with a mighty hand, bringing them out of slavery into a new beginning. As they departed, the Egyptians, now fearful of further devastation, urged them to leave quickly, even giving them silver, gold, and fine clothing. What had once been a people oppressed and impoverished were now departing not just as freed slaves, but as a nation set apart by divine providence. The fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham was in motion. For the Israelites, the first Passover was not just about deliverance from Egypt. It was a foreshadowing of something even greater to come. Centuries later, another lamb without blemish would be sacrificed, and his blood would mark the doorway to eternal salvation. The connection was unmistakable. Just as the blood of the lamb spared the Israelites from death, the blood of Christ would offer redemption to all who believe. And so, as the Israelites stepped into the unknown, they were no longer a people defined by oppression, but by the covenant of the Almighty. The journey was just beginning. Ahead lay the wilderness, the Red Sea, and trials that would test their faith. But on that night, one truth was undeniable. The power of God was with them, and their destiny was forever changed. The Israelites had finally escaped Egypt, but their journey was far from over. As they traveled toward freedom, Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. Regret and anger consumed him. He had just released an entire nation of slaves, crippling his empire. Gathering his elite chariots and warriors, he pursued the Israelites, determined to bring them back. The scene was set for one of the most awe-inspiring miracles in history. The Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's advancing army and the vast expanse of the Red Sea. Fear and panic spread through the camp as they questioned Moses. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" But Moses, standing firm in faith, delivered a declaration that would echo through the ages. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then, in a moment that would define the power of God for generations to come, the Almighty instructed Moses to raise his staff over the sea. As he obeyed, a mighty wind arose, splitting the waters and creating a path of dry land through the heart of the sea. The Israelites, in absolute wonder, walked through the towering walls of water on either side, a passage made by divine intervention. Every step they took was a testament to the unwavering power of their deliverer. Pharaoh's army, blinded by arrogance, charged into the miraculous pathway, convinced they could reclaim their fleeing slaves. But as the last Israelite set foot on the opposite shore, God commanded Moses to stretch his staff once more. The waters, held back by divine force, came crashing down with unrelenting fury. Chariots, horses, and warriors were swallowed by the sea, leaving no survivors. The oppressor had been utterly defeated. Awe and reverence swept over the Israelites. As they stood on the shore, gazing at the waters that had once been their prison and had now become their salvation, they erupted into a song of praise, led by Moses and Miriam. "The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. The horse and rider he has hurled into the sea." Their voices carried the weight of gratitude, triumph, and newfound faith. This moment was more than an escape. It was a revelation. The Israelites had witnessed firsthand the limitless power of God, who not only delivered them but destroyed the forces that had enslaved them. Their journey was just beginning, and ahead lay the wilderness, trials, and the shaping of a nation. But one thing was now certain: the God who split the sea would never abandon them. Even today, the story of the Red Sea miracle serves as a reminder that no obstacle is too great for the power of God. When all seems lost, when there is no visible way forward, faith makes a way. The same God who led his people through impossible waters continues to lead those who trust in him. The victory was not just for Israel. It was a declaration to the world that the Almighty reigns over all. As the Israelites continued their journey into the wilderness, their faith was strengthened, but challenges still lay ahead. Hunger, thirst, and uncertainty would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. The path to the Promised Land was not just about reaching a destination, but about transformation. The trials ahead would reveal whether they truly trusted the one who had parted the sea for them. The Israelites had witnessed the unimaginable, the parting of the Red Sea, and their miraculous deliverance from Pharaoh's army. But their journey was far from over. As they ventured into the wilderness, the initial joy of freedom gave way to the harsh realities of desert life. With no food or water in sight, their faith was put to the test. The same people who had seen the power of God firsthand began to grumble, asking, "Did you bring us out here to die?" Moses, unwavering in his trust, turned to God, and the Almighty responded with provision. Each morning, a fine, flake-like substance appeared on the ground. It was manna, bread from heaven, sustaining them day by day. There was no way to store it for the future. They had to trust that God would provide fresh manna each morning. This daily dependence on divine sustenance was more than nourishment. It was a lesson in faith and obedience. But the trials continued. When they grew thirsty, they again complained, doubting God's care. Moses struck a rock at God's command, and water gushed forth, quenching the thirst of the entire nation. These miracles were not just about survival. They were about teaching Israel to trust in the one who had led them out of Egypt. Each need they encountered became an opportunity for God to reveal his faithfulness. In the wilderness, the Israelites also faced their first external threat. The Amalekites, a fierce and warlike people, attacked them. But Israel did not fight alone. As long as Moses held up his staff, the Israelites prevailed. When his arms grew tired, Aaron and Hur supported them, ensuring victory. This was yet another demonstration that their strength was not in weapons or numbers, but in the power of God. Beyond physical provision, God also gave them structure. At Mount Sinai, he provided the 10 Commandments, setting them apart as his chosen people. These were not just laws, but a covenant, a divine contract that would define them as a nation. The wilderness was not just a place of hardship. It was a place of transformation, where a group of former slaves were being shaped into a people of faith. Yet, despite these incredible provisions, the Israelites continued to struggle with doubt. How often do we find ourselves questioning God's presence when challenges arise? The story of the wilderness reminds us that faith is not just about seeing miracles, but trusting in the one who performs them. Through manna, water from the rock, victory over enemies, and divine laws, God was revealing his character. He was not just a deliverer. He was their provider, their protector, and their guide. Every trial was an opportunity for them to grow, to learn, and to rely on him more deeply. As they continued their journey, new tests awaited. Would they learn to fully trust the one who had carried them this far? The Promised Land was ahead, but their greatest challenge was not the distance, it was their faith. Would they believe that the power of God who had parted the sea and fed them in the desert would also bring them safely to their inheritance? The Israelites had survived the trials of the wilderness, experiencing the power of God in miraculous ways. But their journey was not just about survival. It was about learning to trust in divine strength rather than their own. That trust would soon be tested again when they faced their first major battle. The Amalekites, a fierce and nomadic people, launched an unprovoked attack against Israel at Rephidim. Unlike Pharaoh's army, which had pursued them in Egypt, this was a new enemy, striking at their weakest point, when they were weary and unprepared. But God had not brought them this far to let them fall. Moses appointed Joshua to lead the warriors into battle while he ascended a nearby hill with the staff of God in his hand. as the battle raged below, an extraordinary phenomenon took place. When Moses lifted his staff, Israel prevailed. When his hands grew tired and lowered, the Amalekites gained ground. It was clear that victory was not dependent on military might, but on divine intervention. Recognizing the significance of Moses' actions, Aaron and Hur stepped forward, supporting his hands so that they remained steady until sunset. With unwavering faith and determination, Joshua led the Israelite army to victory. This moment was more than a military triumph. It was a declaration that Israel's strength came not from swords or strategy, but from their reliance on the power of God. After the battle, God commanded Moses to record this event as a lasting memorial, ensuring that future generations would remember that the Amalekites had opposed his chosen people. He also instructed Moses to build an altar, naming it Jehovah Nissi, meaning, "The Lord is my banner." This name signified that their victory was not just an earthly achievement, but a spiritual declaration that God alone was their protector and leader. The battle against Amalek was a lesson in endurance and faith. It demonstrated that when God's people rely on Him, even their weaknesses become strengths. But it also carried a warning. Israel would face many more battles, both physical and spiritual, and their success would always depend on their trust in the Almighty. In our own lives, we often encounter struggles that seem insurmountable. Like the Israelites, we may feel weary, unprepared, or outmatched. Yet the story of this battle reminds us that victory does not come from our own strength, but from lifting our hands in faith, trusting in the one who fights on our behalf. With their first battle behind them, the Israelites continued forward, knowing that the power of God would go before them. But greater challenges awaited. Ahead lay Mount Sinai, where they would receive not just victories in battle, but the very laws that would define them as a nation. Would they embrace their calling and fully trust in the covenant their God was about to establish? The Israelites had witnessed the mighty power of God through deliverance, provision, and victory in battle. But their journey was about to take a new turn. They had seen His miracles. Now, they were about to hear His voice. The next stage of their journey was not about survival. It was about transformation, and that transformation would take place at Mount Sinai. After 3 months of travel, the Israelites arrived at the foot of the great mountain. This was not just a stop along the way. It was a divine appointment. God had chosen this place to establish His covenant with His people. Moses ascended the mountain, and there God spoke, "If you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." The people trembled with awe as they prepared for the sacred encounter. They were instructed to consecrate themselves, washing their clothes and abstaining from anything impure. For 3 days, they waited. Then, on the third day, the mountain was engulfed in thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud. A loud trumpet blast sounded, and the earth shook as the presence of God descended upon Sinai. The Almighty was about to speak to His chosen people. From the mountaintop, God gave the 10 commandments, the divine laws that would define Israel as a nation set apart. "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord." These were not just rules, but a foundation for a people called to reflect His holiness. The people, overwhelmed by the voice of God, pleaded with Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." The sheer power of the divine presence was more than they could bear. So Moses became their mediator, receiving the laws and bringing them to the people. These commandments were more than moral guidelines. They were the very terms of the covenant between God and Israel. They established a way of life rooted in justice, righteousness, and devotion. If followed, they would lead the nation into blessings. But if broken, they would bring consequences. The Israelites stood at a pivotal moment. Would they commit themselves to this divine calling? The giving of the law at Sinai was not just a moment in history. It was a revelation of God's character and His desire for a holy people. Even today, these commandments remain foundational, a moral compass that guides lives across generations. The covenant was not about legalism. It was about relationship, about walking in alignment with the will of the Creator. But as we know, the Israelites would soon face their greatest test yet. While Moses remained on the mountain receiving further instructions, the people grew restless. Their impatience would lead them into grave error, and their faithfulness to the covenant would be tested. Would they remain steadfast, or would they turn away so soon after witnessing the power of God? The covenant had been established, and the Israelites now had the divine law to guide them. But God's presence was not meant to remain distant. It was meant to dwell among his people. And so, he gave Moses instructions to build the tabernacle, a sacred dwelling where he would meet with them. This was more than a structure. It was a visible sign that the power of God was in their midst. Every detail of the tabernacle was precise and purposeful. The materials, gold, silver, bronze, fine linen, and acacia wood, were gathered from the contributions of the Israelites, a people who once had nothing but now gave freely to the work of the Lord. Skilled craftsmen, filled with the Spirit of God, constructed the sanctuary according to divine specifications. Every measurement, every fabric, every vessel was designed to reflect heavenly realities. At the heart of the tabernacle stood the most holy place, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. This sacred chest, overlaid with pure gold, contained the tablets of the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna, and Aaron's budding staff. Above the ark, between the cherubim, was the mercy seat, the very place where God's presence would descend in glory. The tabernacle was designed with 3 sections: the outer court, the holy place, and the most holy place. In the outer court stood the bronze altar for sacrifices and the laver for purification. Within the holy place, the golden lampstand, the table of showbread, and the altar of incense symbolized God's provision, light, and intercession. But only the high priest could enter the most holy place, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, to make atonement for the sins of the people. Through this sacred structure, God was teaching Israel profound spiritual truths. Sin required sacrifice, holiness required cleansing, worship required reverence, and above all, God desired to dwell with his people, not as a distant force, but as a living presence among them. When the tabernacle was completed, a cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord filled the sanctuary. It was a powerful affirmation that God had accepted their offering and would indeed dwell among them. Whenever the cloud lifted, the Israelites set out on their journey. When it remained, they stayed. Their every move was directed by the presence of God. The tabernacle was not just for that generation, it pointed to something greater. Centuries later, Jesus Christ would come as the ultimate fulfillment of God's desire to dwell among his people. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, John wrote, revealing that Christ was the true dwelling place of God on earth. The Israelites had a visible reminder of God's presence, but would they remain faithful? The journey was not over. More trials lay ahead, and soon their devotion would be tested in a way that would shake the very foundations of their covenant with the Almighty. The Israelites had seen the power of God, had received his commandments, and had witnessed his presence dwelling among them. Yet, despite all these divine encounters, their faith was fragile. As Moses remained on Mount Sinai, receiving further instructions from the Lord, the people grew impatient. They turned to Aaron and demanded, "Make us gods who will go before us." And in an act of weakness, Aaron conceded, fashioning a golden calf from the gold of the people. The sight of the golden calf ignited a frenzy of celebration among the Israelites. They declared, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." It was a moment of tragic irony. Those who had been rescued by the one true God were now worshiping a lifeless idol of their own making. Their impatience had turned into rebellion, and their gratitude into forgetfulness. Up on the mountain, God's wrath burned against his people. He told Moses, "They have quickly turned aside from my commands." God was prepared to destroy them and start anew with Moses. But Moses, in an act of intercession, pleaded on behalf of Israel. He reminded God of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appealing to his mercy and faithfulness. And the Lord relented, showing his grace even in the face of Israel's betrayal. When Moses descended and saw the revelry, his anger burned. He shattered the tablets of the covenant, symbolizing the broken relationship between Israel and God. He confronted Aaron, who weakly excused his actions, claiming the calf had simply come out of the fire. Moses then called for a decision. "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." The Levites answered the call, and judgment was executed upon those who refused to repent. Yet, even after this act of discipline, Moses returned to God, seeking atonement for the people's sin. "If you will not forgive them," he prayed, "blot me out of your book." It was a foreshadowing of the ultimate intercessor, Jesus Christ, who would later offer himself for the redemption of all mankind. God forgave, but there were consequences. The people suffered a plague, and many perished as a result of their rebellion. Despite their failure, God did not abandon Israel. He renewed his covenant, instructing Moses to carve new tablets and reaffirming his promise to lead them to the promised land. But the lesson was clear. Obedience and faithfulness were the foundation of their relationship with God. Idolatry, impatience, and rebellion had nearly cost them everything. This episode in Israel's history serves as a stark warning. How often do we, in moments of waiting and uncertainty, create our own golden calves, turning to false securities instead of trusting in the power of God? The Israelites had been freed from Egypt, but their hearts still struggled with captivity. True freedom required more than physical deliverance. It demanded a transformation of faith. With the covenant renewed, Israel's journey continued. The promised land was still ahead, but their greatest battle would not be against external enemies. It would be the battle within, the struggle to remain faithful to the one who had never abandoned them. Even after their rebellion with the golden calf, God did not utterly forsake Israel. His justice demanded consequences, but his mercy provided a path to restoration. This balance between judgment and grace would define Israel's journey, revealing the character of the Almighty. Moses, standing once again before God, pleaded for the people. "If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways," he asked, seeking assurance that God would still go with them. In response, God proclaimed his divine nature. The Lord, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Here, the power of God was revealed not only in might, but in his righteous justice and unrelenting mercy. God commanded Moses to chisel new tablets, restoring the covenant that had been broken. This was an act of renewal, a second chance for Israel to embrace their identity as his chosen people. They had faced judgment, but through repentance, they were given another opportunity to walk in obedience. To reinforce his presence among them, God's glory descended upon Moses. When he came down from Mount Sinai, his face radiated with divine light, so much so that the Israelites were afraid to approach him. This visible transformation was proof that an encounter with God changes everything. It was a foretaste of the transformation he desired for all his people. Yet the journey ahead would still require faithfulness. The wilderness was both a place of testing and preparation. God's laws were not given as mere rules, but as a foundation for a just and holy society. The commandments instructed them to care for the poor, uphold justice, and remain set apart from the nations around them. Mercy was never separate from righteousness. The two worked together to shape Israel into a people that reflected God's character. But history would show that human nature struggles with faithfulness. Again and again, Israel would waver, drawn to idolatry and self-reliance. And yet, every time they repented, God showed mercy. His justice brought discipline, but his love always made a way for redemption. This tension between judgment and grace was not a contradiction. It was the essence of the covenant. Even today, the justice and mercy of God remain a profound truth. He does not ignore sin, but he offers forgiveness to those who turn back to him. The story of Israel is a mirror of the human condition, a reminder that while we are prone to failure, the power of God is greater than our weaknesses. The Israelites would continue their journey, carrying both the weight of their past failures and the promise of future blessings. The promised land was before them, but the question remained, would they remain faithful? Their story was far from over, and the next challenges would demand not just obedience, but unwavering trust in the God who had never abandoned them. The story of Exodus is not just an ancient narrative. It is a timeless testament to the power of God, faith, and the journey of transformation. Each event, from the oppression in Egypt to the divine deliverance, carries lessons that remain relevant today. The Exodus challenges believers to trust in God's provision, walk in obedience, and remain steadfast even in the face of trials. One of the most profound lessons is that deliverance is not just about leaving bondage. It is about learning to live in freedom. The Israelites were physically freed from Egypt, yet their hearts often longed for the familiarity of captivity. How often do we, too, struggle to let go of past burdens, even when God calls us to something greater? True liberation requires a renewal of the mind and a willingness to step into the unknown with faith. Another key takeaway is the importance of obedience. The Israelites received divine commandments meant to shape them into a holy nation. Yet, time and time again, they wavered, succumbing to doubt, fear, and rebellion. God's laws were not meant to restrict them, but to guide them into abundant life. In the same way, modern believers are called to follow His ways, not out of obligation, but out of love and trust. Faith is also a recurring theme throughout Exodus. Whether at the shores of the Red Sea or in the wilderness seeking provision, the Israelites had to learn that the power of God is greater than any earthly force. They witnessed miracles, yet their trust wavered when circumstances became difficult. This reminds us that faith is not just about seeing, it is about believing, even when the outcome is unclear. The journey of Exodus teaches perseverance. The promised land was before them, but it was not reached overnight. The process of refinement, testing, and growth was essential. Likewise, our spiritual journeys require endurance. There are times of waiting, of challenges that test our resolve. Yet through it all, God remains faithful. Leadership and intercession are also highlighted in Moses' role. He was not a perfect man, yet he was chosen to lead. His relationship with God, his prayers for the people, and his willingness to stand in the gap reflect the heart of true leadership. One that serves, sacrifices, and seeks divine wisdom above all else. The lessons of Exodus extend beyond the Israelites. They point forward to the ultimate deliverance through Jesus Christ, the true Passover Lamb. Just as the blood of the Lamb marked the Israelites for salvation, Christ's sacrifice offers redemption for all who believe. The Exodus foreshadows the greater work of salvation, reminding us that God's plan has always been one of rescue and restoration. In the end, Exodus is a call to remember. To remember that God is faithful. To remember that trials are not the end of the story. To remember that every challenge is an opportunity to trust in His sovereignty. And most importantly, to remember that the power of God that led the Israelites to freedom is the same power that walks with us today. The question remains, how will we respond to the lessons of Exodus? Will we trust, obey, and step into the fullness of what God has prepared? The journey continues, and our faith is still being refined, just as it was for those who walked before us. The story of Exodus is more than an ancient tale. It is a living testimony of God's power, justice, and mercy. From the oppression in Egypt to the revelation at Mount Sinai, every step of Israel's journey was filled with divine purpose. But the real question is, what does this story mean for you today? Exodus reminds us that deliverance is not just about escaping something. It is about stepping into something greater. Just like the Israelites, we are called to leave behind bondage, whether it is fear, doubt, or past failures, and walk in the freedom that God has prepared for us. But freedom requires faith. The wilderness was not a punishment. It was a process of refinement, a training ground for trust and obedience. How often do we, like the Israelites, waver in our faith when challenges arise? God showed them His power, time and time again, yet they struggled with doubt. But even in their failures, His mercy remained. This is the same God who walks with us today. He calls us to trust Him, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. As you reflect on the journey of Exodus, ask yourself, what is the Red Sea in your life? What are the golden calves you need to leave behind? Are you walking in faith, or are you still longing for the familiarity of the past? The same power of God that led Israel to freedom is at work in your life. But the choice remains yours. Will you step into the promise, or will you remain in the wilderness? If this story has inspired you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future insights into faith, history, and divine purpose. Let's continue this journey together, because the lessons of Exodus are still unfolding today.